Hello and welcome to Libations and Lectionaries. I'm Reverend Jimmy Gaughan. A quick programming note. This coming Sunday, August the 5th, there will be a special live stream video episode of Libations and Lectionaries as part of the nationwide Hamilton Preach-In. I will be preaching on the text of the adulterous woman from the 8th chapter of John, using the song The Reynolds Pamphlet from Hamilton for comparison. So be sure to tune in Facebook Live at noon Eastern on Sunday, August 5th, and if you miss it, it will be available in both video and podcast form afterwards. And now, on with the show. Jesus said to them, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall not hunger, and he who believes on me shall never thirst. But I said to you that you have seen me, and yet do not believe. Hello, and welcome to Libations and Lectionaries. I'm Reverend Jimmy Gaughan. This is the 13th episode, I think, maybe the 12th episode, I'd have to check. And this week we're going to be talking about what Will Willimon calls a nearly incomprehensible text from the 6th chapter of the Gospel of John, the 24th through 35th verses. I am pleased this week to welcome to the program my second non-wake divinity guest, the Reverend Tiffany Curtis. Tiffany, hello.
Hi, Jimmy. Thanks for having me on your show. It's nice to be here.
It's always fun to have people. Tiffany joins us over Skype as, she lives in New Mexico. And
yes.
It's a little ways from North Carolina.
New Mexico. I am the minister of First Christian Church of Santa Fe in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and also working a lot on immigration organizing. I started and I'm the organizer of the Santa Fe Faith Network for Immigrant Justice, which probably won't come up with this text, but just so you know, that's what I do. And I'm hoping to preach on this nearly incomprehensible text this weekend, so I'm hoping this conversation will illuminate it more for me. I'm probably not going to bring, the deepest exegesis to the conversation, but we'll see what happens.
I get that. I totally do. And quite honestly, if we depart from the text and talk about, real world events that actually matter to Christians, then so be it. This is my podcast. We'll do what I want. And you've been doing organizing for a long time, if I recall correctly, like since you were at Chapman.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I've been doing organizing for many years in different forms and ways, so certainly a passion of mine, and especially faith-based organizing.
Sure. Well, it's needed right now more than ever. Did you see that Tony Perkins has been named to the Religious Liberty Task Force? Yeah. Of all people, the guy who wants to force his religion down everybody's throats, named to the Religious Liberty Task Force.
Yeah, this whole religious liberty tactic that certain people are taking is pretty maddening.
Yeah, I get it. I used to live in the conservative realm, but using that to justify not making a friggin' cake, or whatever, it's like, really, guys? Have you read Matthew 25 lately? That whole thing about whatever you did not do to the least of these, you also did not do to me? Because clearly you haven't.
Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty egregious to use religious reasons to justify human rights violations and civil rights abuses, but it has a pretty long history.
Oh, yeah.
The same exact biblical verses are trotted out over and over again in pretty sordid ways, so, the same thing. It is sad as a person of faith to see it happen over and over again.
It certainly is. And you notice how those words are never actually from the Gospels, never things Jesus said. They're always from Paul or, like, the Torah.
And some misquote and, sort of pulling out of context of some Pauline verse.
Right.
Okay.
It's like, Here's how we justify slavery in the Civil War. Here's how we justify throwing kids in concentration camps and old Walmarts right now. Yay, Romans 13. Oh, but wait, let's not forget about the rest of that passage. I feel like this is the third episode of this in a row I've gotten off on that on. But, it's kind of an egregious abuse.
Yeah, it's egregious, so it's hard to, if you know anything about the Bible, it's hard to not kind of go off on that. So it's sort of like, wow, let me tell you what's 2 verses later,
Right. I'll tell you about how it then says, do everything in love, and if you don't, well, then you've missed the point.
Right.
Yeah. Anyway, 5 minutes in. That didn't take long. But, like I said, this is my podcast, and if we want to talk about things other than Jesus telling the Capernaum residents about how they've completely missed the point, then that's what we're going to do. Anyway, so my libation tonight is non-alcoholic, but it has a long history with, North Carolina, where I live. This is Cheerwine. Their motto is stupid. It's born in the South, raised in a glass. Which I get it, but I find it silly. It, however, is delicious. It is, for all intents and purposes, just a cherry soda, but there's something about it, and I don't know if it's just, it being from the South and having actual sugar in it instead of high fructose corn syrup, but it's good stuff. And they've been around since 1917, so they've been making it for a while. And, gosh, I think the first time I had it was back in, would have been 2006 or 2007, sometime around there. A friend of mine, Paige, who was at Salem College in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, brought it to a meeting that we were both at to share as a regional food, and that was the first time I had it, and I thought it was magical. Then years later, when Katie and I got married, I had come out to North Carolina to get married. And 2 of my friends from Phoenix had flown out as groomsmen. I picked them up late night at the airport. We stopped at a fast food place to get dinner because they were hungry, and it was like midnight. And I got Cheerwine, and they were both like, "What's Cheerwine?" And I said, well, it is a soda of the gods handed down to mankind by the Lord's self. And they tried it, and they were like, meh, it's okay. And I accused them of heresy. So, I enjoy it. How about you?
Great.
What are you drinking tonight?
Let's see. Well, I have 2 libations, neither of which have that much of a story. One is what I like to call LaCroix, although there's much controversy over the pronunciation, and I get accused of being snobbish for pronouncing it in such a way. Well, I've heard it pronounced LaCroix.
It's a French word. Why would you not pronounce it the French way?
Of the lemon flavor variety with the lemon in it.
Very nice.
And I also have Sauvignon Blanc from California.
Okay. Any particular vineyard or just...
I cannot remember. Okay. I remember that it's from California.
Fair enough.
Yeah, not a huge boozer, so I don't really tend to have many things around, but had some wine, had some LaCroix, so those are my libations for our conversation.
I understand you can make a particularly good LaCroix and vodka, and it just tastes like LaCroix, except it gets you drunk. I don't know. I've never tried it. Honestly, the only drink I've had in I think the past 2 weeks was on Sunday, after finishing up a week of Aiders Camp. The staff all went to a Mexican restaurant, and we were drinking margaritas by 11:30 in the morning, which should tell you how fun this week of Aiders Camp was.
Wow.
I mean, yeah. It was fun, don't get me wrong, but it was trying. I don't know, the summer you did DPF, I don't know if you visited an Aiders Camp at all.
No, I've never been to an Aiders Camp.
It's all 14-year-olds, and sometimes you just want to drop kick a 14-year-old. especially when you're talking about sex all week and they're getting crazy.
It was a sex camp?
Oh, yeah. Aiders is sex camp.
Oh, okay. Got it.
Yeah.
I definitely never have experienced that. Well, that's exciting. What curriculum do you use? Our Whole Lives?
It's by the same people.
Okay.
It's except it's called Created to Be Me. There's a camp curriculum and then there's a Sunday school curriculum, which is what Our Whole Lives is. And they've been doing Created to Be Me for Aiders Camp since the late 80s. They actually just revamped it last year. And it's good curriculum, but it has an unfortunate heterocentric focus wherein LGBTQ plus sexuality is barely touched on. It gets brought up, but it barely gets touched on, which I think is a mistake, especially since I had a gay kid in my cabin, and I'm like, so what are we doing for him, And then, too, and maybe this is something that I feel is an equity issue more as an adult than they would care about as 14-year-olds, but the male orgasm is discussed at significant length because it's part of the reproductive process, and the female orgasm gets like 30 seconds.
Wow, that's pretty bad, man. Yeah. That's pretty bad. You got to change that curriculum.
Yeah, so like I said, it's still a very good curriculum in terms of teaching 14-year-olds about the ins and outs of sex and what you should do, what you should not do, if you're going to do this, here's what you need to do. But it still has a long way to go. So, I feel
like OWL is very queer and trans inclusive. I'm surprised it's by the same people, but doesn't.
Well, and I think that's the difference between having an extended period of time over which to do a curriculum versus a week of camp. I feel like there's some things they would have to shuffle in order to expand it as I think it should be expanded. And I don't know how that would be done, but people smarter than me who get paid to do it should figure it out.
It sounds like it.
Anyway, so yeah, that's what I did last week, and that's why I was having a margarita at 11:30 on Sunday morning.
Yes.
Which, now that I think about it, there's not a whole lot of places that you can actually do that, but because so many of the laws in the Kansas City area were shaped by Anheuser-Busch, it's a different story there.
Yeah. Unlike Boston, where I lived for many years, where there is no happy hour. Happy hour is illegal.
What?
Yeah. And this actually has changed, but you couldn't buy alcohol on Sunday, which I know is true, in many places. Sure. But the no happy hour thing, though, that was really, as like a student, most of the time I lived there, that was kind of sad.
Just thinking about that as a city that was founded by the Irish.
It was founded by the Puritans.
Oh, that's right. It was founded by the Puritans. It's just mostly Irish now.
Came later and did, end up dominating much of the culture, but no, the original roots are strong. The original post-colonial interventions, right, the whole Puritan thing.
That's right.
It's pretty serious.
The Puritans were so uptight they thought the Baptists were heretics and made Roger Williams go found Rhode Island. That's right.
Exactly. They kicked them out to another area.
Yeah. Yay, religious history. Yay, religious liberty. And now we have come full circle.
There you go.
So, do we want to try talking about this text?
Yes.
All right.
Let's. I want to hear from your book that you have there, since I don't have it. Maybe it'll help me write my sermon.
So, Feasting on the Word is a...
I've heard it's a good one, I don't have it.
It's a great commentary. Barbara Brown Taylor is one of the editors. I happen to like it because a lot of my professors from Wake Forest Divinity contributed to it.
Nice.
Like, my Old Testament professor contributed. Our former dean, who also taught my class on Revelation, which was eye-opening, she contributed to it. My church history professor contributed to it. The real church history professor, who was on sabbatical the year I took church history, he contributed to it. So, a lot of people contributed to it.
There you go.
Yeah. None of them contributed to this passage. The only person whose name I recognized who contributed on this passage was Will Willimon. So, yeah. I mean, as far as I can tell, this passage is all about the people not understanding Jesus, which is not a particularly new and novel concept for the Gospels.
Right.
You know, just the number of times that people don't understand Jesus in the Gospels. Like, you think about,
it's a huge trope, for sure.
Yeah. Like, and especially in the Gospel of John, you think about in the third chapter when Nicodemus makes his midnight trip to go see Jesus and understands nothing. You know,
right?
I feel like the writer of the Gospel of John reaches a certain point where he's just beating a dead horse. You know, yeah, okay, so Jesus was talking to the people and they didn't understand him. What else is new? It's the year 2018 and people still don't understand Jesus.
Right. Yeah. No, it's, so I preached on the lectionary selection for last week that immediately precedes this, and it's the story of the feeding of the 5,000, which is in all four Gospels. And in John's version, at least, they get excited and they want to make him a king.
Right.
It says, in fact, they want to take him by force to make him a king.
Verse 15,
which is,
when Jesus realized that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself.
Right. So it's definitely, I guess, there's that misunderstanding trope there as well, you know, where there's sort of like, oh, wow, you gave us manna in the wilderness like Moses. That's amazing. We want more of that. You have power. You're a healer. We've been following you around. You know, be our king.
Right.
And so then he pieces out and escapes. And then that's where this week's lectionary reading picks up, is then they find him on the other side of the sea and they say, how long have you been here? Or when did you arrive, or something? Which he doesn't answer that question and instead starts talking about the bread of life.
You know, that particular piece of it, the part where they're trying to put him in power and he gets out of there and they come hunt him down, it makes me think of nothing more than a minister trying to practice good self-care and enact healthy boundaries, whose congregation hunts them down. What are you doing? Help us. Feed us. It's like, leave me alone. I've never had that experience. You know,
I'm sorry to hear that. I feel like I honestly don't really struggle with that much, which I guess I'm very blessed.
You are so blessed.
Not harass me very much. They let me do what I want to do.
That's good, because I've had issues with that at the churches I've served, and I know a lot of people who have. And let me tell you, there are active duty chaplaincy is not for everybody, but there are some things to be said about the fact that when it's the weekend and you're on liberty, nobody bugs you.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, it's a very different kind of job. Like, I served as a hospital chaplain for a while. And similarly, I mean, it's extremely intense when you're there. But other than the prearranged on-call times that you have, you are not on call. You leave.
Right.
So there's a lot of boundaries inherent to that position in a way that is obviously different than parish ministry.
Yes. Now,
yeah. There's pluses and minuses for sure, but
I suppose that being the Son of God, Jesus didn't have set on-call times.
Probably not, no.
But still, there are a number.
He was obviously trying to escape them.
Right.
And they came and found him. So.
And there's a number of places throughout the gospel where it says Jesus went off by himself because Jesus needed some alone time. Jesus was sleeping under the deck of a ship in the middle of a thunderstorm, which kind of tells me Jesus was exhausted.
Right.
So, Son of God, sure. Also human. Leave the dude alone. But, I do look at this as kind of a companion to Jesus meeting with the woman at the well in John 4. Because at the end of this text, the people still not understanding say, Sir, give us this bread always.
Yeah.
They still think he's talking about literal bread. They want him to continue taking and multiplying loaves of bread so that they will never be hungry. Which, in John 4, when Jesus meets with the woman at the well, he says, the one who drinks of, I don't remember the exact words, water of life, the water of spirit.
Water of life,
will never again be thirsty. And the interesting thing here is, I don't know that the Samaritan woman fully understood what he was talking about, but I think she got it better than these people did. And all Jesus did was sit down and have a conversation with her. She didn't witness him perform a miracle.
Oh, right.
Yeah. And that might have actually been to their detriment to have witnessed a miracle. They believe because they have seen, not just because they have understood. That's interesting to think about Jesus making a mistake in performing a sign rather than just talking to them.
Yeah. I feel like that theme that you just brought up is present a lot. Especially in Paul, maybe more so than in the Gospels, but this idea of like, what is the difference between those who have seen versus those who have believed without seeing? And I think from, my sort of exegesis on that is that people often take that as this endorsement of blind faith. Right. But I really see it more as trying to be emotionally comforting to people like us who, were not there for all of these events that are described. We didn't see any of that happen. And so, what does that mean for our connection to this religious tradition, to this person, who's written about and sort of, I don't know whether it's good or bad for them to have seen miracles, but, for most of us who perhaps at least in a certain sense don't feel like we've seen miracles, though I would argue we've probably seen many, many millions of miracles. How do we relate to this person? How do we relate to this tradition? Like, do we still have the same kind of claim on it? And I feel like Paul especially was trying to say over and over again, you do,
Sure. Because
there is much of this.
Because everything Paul wrote was long after Jesus was on earth.
Yeah.
Paul
so
himself
he's writing to us in a sense too.
Yeah. Paul himself never came face to face with Jesus, except in the terms of the spiritual sense on the Damascus Road. So even Paul, would have had to rely on faith rather than seeing the works. But something occurred to me while we were talking about how I felt like this was a theme, not just in these two places, but throughout the book of John. Because if you go back to the first chapter, the call of Nathanael. How do you know me, Nathanael asked. Jesus answered, I saw you while you were still under the fig tree before Philip called you. Nathanael declared, Rabbi, you are the Son of God. Jesus said, you believe because I told you I saw you. So it's like, I feel like this is something that John keeps hitting on. I don't know where to go with that, but, you know.
Yeah. No, I mean, it seems like there is this. Well, I feel like John has this theme over and over again of, I don't know, I guess you could call it sort of like a mystical lens where people see a certain thing, but what's really going on is way beyond what they see. And so there's sort of this, you know, again and again, people seeing something, perceiving it as one thing, and then, but what Jesus is really trying to do, or what's really happening, is way beyond what they thought or expected, or even can understand. And I feel like, you know, this passage is very much in that same kind of vein of like, yes, he performs this miracle similar to the miracle of manna in the wilderness, you know, which is this familiar story for these people, and they're amazed by that. But, you know, then he goes on to say, like, it's actually about something way beyond that. You know, it's about this bread of life, which is not manna from heaven, it's me. You know, it gets super mystical.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, if you take Jesus' teachings as a work, like Thomas Jefferson did, for example, when he cut the teachings out of the Gospels and assembled those, he really and truly is a mystic teacher above all else. Now,
absolutely.
Everything he talks about in some way or another is not about the things of this world. It is about the things of the spiritual realm. You know, up to and including how the things we do in this world affect not just our spiritual life, but the spiritual lives of those we encounter. And yeah, that was a tangent. But
yeah. No, I think there's that that quality of Jesus being definitely grounded in this world and in the realities of his social context, and yet holding that tension of always pointing to how those things are also just seeds and symbols pointing to something far beyond that, and really trying to teach very complex and profound sort of mystery to people through concrete metaphors. You know, it was all about these parables, most of which were pretty agrarian, you know, but that were very mysterious, very mystical in the way, you know, that he presented them, and kind of like koans, you know, like what does that really mean?
Yeah, and I mean, there's one point of that right in the middle of this passage where the people ask him, what must we do to perform the works of God? You know, and I think our assumption of what the works of God are, even now, is, you know, doing good, basically. But right here, Jesus says, this is the work of God, that you believe in him who he has sent. So, and I feel like that kind of lends itself, that verse, if you proof text it, just completely take it out of context, that verse lends itself to the whole idea of everything you have to do is about belief and faith. Nothing that you do on this earth is going to matter. So, you know, I think you have to be careful there. And I think that's the admonition, like, of the writer of the Epistle of James, where he says faith without works is dead. Because belief in God, to me at least, implies care for God's creation and for God's children, regardless of who or what they are.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I mean, I think I totally agree with you. It's one of those things where it can be read in a way that props up a certain worldview, but if you actually really take into account what does that mean to believe in this being and this deity and this, force that we call God. That actually, to truly believe means to act in accordance with your belief as well. It's definitely a balance between those things. And, it's to believe that God is present in creation, is present in our neighbors, and that, we must honor that spirit within them. Because if we don't, then clearly we don't actually believe that.
Yep. Well, you might get some pushback on that from people who own bakeries and such, but... And so we come full circle again. So let's see. What else is in this passage? Is there anything we haven't really talked about?
Let's see. I'm trying to think.
I think, like in verse 27, the idea of do not work for the food that perishes, but for the food that endures for eternal life. I think that is a good point. That really, again, you can proof text it and really get a super anti-capitalist verse, or you can take it in the context of Jesus' teaching and still get an anti-capitalist verse, except with good backing. Because he's saying, don't focus on your reward, basically. And I always hesitate. I hesitate so greatly to use texts from one gospel in conjunction with another, except the Christmas story, because, you have to do the narrative if you want to do a Charlie Brown Christmas. But if you take any teaching like this in conjunction with, again, the parable of the sheep and the goats from Matthew 25, everything you do in this life, and I think this also speaks to the whole mystic teaching part, everything you do in this life will affect your spiritual life and will affect the spiritual lives of those around you. So if you work for the things of this world, if you are concerned with your money, if you're concerned with your house, your car, whatever, you're missing the point. At least that's how I take this. And I could be missing the point. I don't know. But that's my best guess.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this sort of interesting, once again, I was talking about how he used these very everyday analogies to talk about things that were very profound and very difficult to describe in any way. And I think, he's talking about bread, right, which is something that people then and now, mostly, unless maybe you're gluten-free, eat every day, and so there's sort of this extremely quotidian quality to it. And I think in a very practical way, I think people could understand that illustration. They didn't have preservatives or refrigerators or freezers, so bread would not last, right? It was something that had to be eaten. It had only a certain point up until which it could be eaten. And so he's using this very concrete metaphor of something that people could understand. Yeah. And he's talking about something that goes way beyond that.
Yeah, use only what you need. Give the rest to people who need it.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I think I saw, well, this is sort of an aside, but I was looking at some of the Greek translation, like literal Greek translation. I don't actually know Greek from this passage. And the eternal piece is literally translated as something more like lasting your whole life, which I think is interesting because it brings up a whole, like I said, it's kind of an aside, but it brings up a whole nother question around like the measurement of time and what do you mean by eternity?
Sure.
Is it without beginning? Is it without end? Is it for the span of a human life? Is it, what is it? But it's certainly this idea of rather than something that has a pretty limited edible shelf life in a like pre-industrial world to something that might last your whole life, or might last from, you know, before or after the measurement of time, however you want to define eternity. Mm-hmm. It's a pretty profound difference that he's articulating, using the same concept of bread, something that gives nourishment, something that feeds you, something that's very basic to everyday life.
Yeah. It seems essential, but it's very temporal and finite.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very, very profound. And
it's just, as you started out, you know, by saying that this person, whoever it was, described this text as nearly incomprehensible. And I think I felt somewhat intimidated when I was reading this passage, because there is this quality to it of, once again, like I said, Jesus trying to sort of describe or like allow people to experience something that is inexplicable.
Right.
So there's like an element that is very challenging for how do you put words around what he's trying to communicate here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Will Willimon, the person who said that, he's a professor at the Divinity School at Duke University, so if he thinks it's incomprehensible, what on earth are the rest of us supposed to do?
Yeah, exactly.
But on that note, I think I have run out of thoughts about this passage.
Fair enough.
Do you have anything further that you have thought that you have not had the chance to discuss yet?
Well, I think I mentioned this before, but I still find it a little bit funny that included in the passage is the people asking him when he got there, right, and him completely ignoring that question and launching into this like mystical diatribe.
Right.
I don't really have a commentary on that. I just find it super interesting and amusing.
Well, I mean, you think about it. That's them being more concerned about time again.
Right.
When did you get here? Why does it matter?
Right.
You know, there are bigger things here than when I got here, guys.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought, and to a certain extent, at least, it plays back to my experience of when did you get here, Pastor? Why does it matter? Here's the sermon.
Yes, as someone who shows up not much before church starts, I kind of agree with that.
Yeah, but you know, if your church gives you your space, I think you're good there. Yeah, my first church. If I wasn't in my office at 8:30, there was hell to pay.
Wow, yeah. Who was monitoring you?
Too many people.
Wow.
But it's not my problem anymore. It hasn't been my problem for more than 2.5 years. So, you know, obviously, I'm supposed to be certain places, certain times now, but that's fine. Anyway, so time is a social construct, and God operates outside of it, and we need to understand things that are deeper than what we can see. I think that's a fair and concise summation of this passage.
That was pretty much my MDiv thesis. So.
All right.
It was actually about the measurement of time, the history of the measurement of time as a form of capitalist control, and how our understanding of time in a liturgical and spiritual lens might help us resist that.
Sure.
Some slightly boring reading for anyone who's interested. Send it to your listeners.
It actually does sound interesting. But I think to that regard, it's good that we repeat the lectionary every 3 years.
Exactly.
Because
it's a reminder of how time is cyclical.
Yeah.
Right? It's not the way that we've been sort of programmed to think it is through very much constructed through trying to control the worker's view of time, right? So there is this quality of the lectionary having a cyclical nature, the liturgical calendar having this returning cyclical quality, the concept of Sabbath. There's all these like sort of alternative ways of measuring time within our traditions, which I think is pretty interesting when you look at clocks, which were literally created to control factory workers. That's why they're created. So.
Interesting. I did not know that. Yeah, but we try to clock the passage of time, try to control it, but everything that has been will be again. I mean, that's the nature of the cyclical life. I don't want to say we're insignificant in the grand scheme of things, but because each person is significant in their own way. But at the same time, nothing we do can stop time. Everything that we learn and do, again, has a deeper meaning outside of what we understand.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Okay,
right.
There you go. That's our summary.
We got something out of this passage, and I think that's important.
I think I have some more fodder for my sermon.
Well, that's good.
I think I'm going to use baking sourdough bread maybe as my sermon illustration.
I think that's a great sermon illustration.
Yeah, because it includes, so there's fermentation involved, but fermentation and like rotting are not far from one another. And so sort of like that question of like, how do we measure?
You're always supposed to start with a piece from the last batch of dough, aren't you?
Yeah.
Yeah. And, interestingly enough, a lot of bourbon is made the same way. They will use some of the fermented product from the last batch to start the next batch because it's
true of much fermentation. Yeah.
So, yeah, that's a great illustration, actually. I'm a fan.
Great. I love fermentation.
Yeah. Hooray, fermentation. As I drink my non-alcoholic soda.
Non-fermented soda.
Yeah. So anyway, now that we've talked about Jesus the mystic and the cyclical nature of time and fermentation, we'll move on.
Great.
What is out there outside of the Bible and the church in pop culture, whether it's secular or religious, if anything, that you find supremely interesting right now?
Well, I do have an answer to that, and it betrays that I'm very behind the times, but I really have a hard time getting into TV shows. You know how people binge watch Netflix? Yeah, I don't really do that. But I finally am binge watching a show that came out a couple of years ago.
Okay.
Was recommended to me 2 years ago, and I finally got around to watching it like a month ago, and now I am obsessed. Jane the Virgin, have you seen it?
I have seen bits and pieces of it, mostly because my wife just finished binge watching it.
Okay. It's amazing. It is my current obsession. And I mean, actually, it's somewhat religious, I suppose. Sure. So the concept of it is this quite devout Catholic young lady who is... Her family's from Venezuela, and she is artificially inseminated due to a medical mistake, though she has vowed to be a virgin until marriage. And so she's a pregnant virgin, and it is a satirical telenovela that has all the telenovela tropes and is absolutely hilarious. I'm obsessed with it.
And if I'm not mistaken, it has a narrator who blatantly reminds you, this is a telenovela, guys.
Yes. Yeah. He constantly reminds you, like, oh, yes, exactly. This is a classic telenovela moment. He has like a Latin, like, classic, like Latin telenovela, like lover dude voice.
Right.
And main character, her father is a telenovela star as well. So it's all very meta. And it is extremely entertaining and addicting.
Well, and you couldn't have picked a better time to watch it because the final season starts in a month.
I know. I'm not that close though. I mean, there's so many episodes.
Yeah.
And even,
like
I said I'm getting into it, but even like my version of binge watching is like 2 episodes at a time. That's like about the extent. So like it's really taking me, a while, but this is the fastest I've ever gone through any show.
Nice. Yeah. I think the only thing I've truly binge watched lately was the new season of Marvel's Luke Cage. And that was only because I had a weekend to finally just sit and do nothing. And I was like, I'm going to watch Luke Cage. But yeah, so I've heard great things about Jane the Virgin. My wife certainly gives it her vote of approval.
Yeah, I highly recommend it. And actually, like I said, the religious themes are present because the main character and her family, which is her mom and her grandma, are like fairly devout, especially the grandma. Mm-hmm. And so there's scenes that involve praying and other forms of religiosity, but then, it's mostly high drama, ridiculous scenarios and cliffhangers. So it's pretty fun.
Sure.
There was also, to bring it back to something that I thought would not come up, in one of the more recent episodes that I saw, there was a definite shout out to immigration reform, which was great. So, because the grandma's undocumented.
Right.
And so that came up. So, it has some good social messages woven in there as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and if I'm not terribly mistaken, Donald Trump got elected like halfway through the show. To the point where they're at right now.
I think the show started in like 2015.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah. Like I said, I'm a little behind. I just started watching it a month ago, finally. But
hey, sometimes that's how it works. And
exactly.
God bless the makers of Netflix, and maybe curse them as well. Well, I started watching season 6 of Orange is the New Black last night. And I have watched the first 2 episodes of this season, and I have no idea what the hell they're doing. So, it'll be interesting.
I have seen 1 episode of that. See, it's funny, like I'm saying, a lot of shows do not hook me.
Yeah.
Like, people were like, such a great show, so I watched the first episode, and I was just like, take it or leave it. I just never watched another one.
Sure, and that show can be a little tough to get into, admittedly. Especially if you're not somebody who wants to sit there and watch the stories of a bunch of basically TV tropes in prison.
Right.
Which is essentially what they are for the first season.
Done a lot of work in prison. Like, it just felt, I don't know. It didn't really speak to me. It did not feel like, yes, obviously it's a show and they're trying to be funny and all that, but I don't know. I didn't feel like it, like, you could do something funny and also really, I only saw 1 episode, so what am I saying? But it seems like you could do something funny and also, like, really highlight the reality of prison, which is in desperate need of reform, but from at least episode 1, I felt like it was kind of like, not.
Sure. And they do get into an exploration of the prison industrial complex in later seasons, so.
Okay, yeah. Like I said, 1 episode is probably not enough for me to have an opinion of the show.
Sure. I will say, even though the 2nd season just came out, I am already looking forward to the 3rd season of Netflix's version of Queer Eye, because they're filming it in and around Kansas City. At places that I know from having lived there, and as a matter of fact, somebody who went to Wake Divinity, who is a pastor at a church in Kansas City, who I know, posted a picture the other day of her with the cast after her church hosted them for part of an episode.
Oh my gosh, that's awesome. Yeah, I have seen not much of the new one at all, but I saw 1 episode that was extremely touching where they were, the person that they were doing the makeover for or whatever was this like very sweet church lady whose son is gay, in Georgia. And it was like, they were hitting all the like big topics about like LGBTQ issues in the church. Like one of the guys was crying, was like, I was super like extremely religious growing up, and I was always at church, and it hurts so much I can't even go into a church anymore. You know, they were going like heavy hitting on all the topics, and I was like, this is amazing.
Yeah. And I know a lot of church people who really connected with that episode. So I'll be interested to see what they do with season 3. I find it much more approachable and, real than the original show from, 10, 15 years ago? Which was, those guys were assholes.
Yeah, I feel like this version has a very different purpose.
Yeah.
It's very much aimed towards, how do you create empathy and like real connections between like conservative people and, in this case, gay men, but like,
right.
Yeah, it seems like it is very sort of missional in a sense.
I think that's a very good way of putting it, because they do have a mission to change people's lives for the better.
Yeah, and like in so doing, to create sort of these bonds that might break down stereotypes or, whatever, disconnection between people who aren't as likely to have friends who are LGBTQ or whatever. And
right.
So yeah, it seems very sweet. This new show.
And it is. I think it's something good, especially for this moment that we're living in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm super impressed by the guys too. Like, I feel like it's not easy to go into a conservative setting and try to be your authentic self. And I feel like they do that with an incredible amount of grace and, yeah, I don't know. It's very impressive to me.
Mm-hmm. And I will be interested to see how the dynamic changes in season 3, because having lived in Kansas City, it strikes me as a much more, liberal place than Atlanta. In no small part because...
My only Kansas City story is I remember we had a General Assembly there, and I was probably 13, and that was my first time ever seeing someone who was, in drag or transvestite or maybe trans, whatever, but that was in Kansas City when I was 13, and I was like, oh, wow, look at that very tall lady in heels, wearing a dress and makeup. So, I do think Kansas City is a different environment than rural Georgia or whatever. So.
Yep. And I'm sure they won't do everything in Kansas City itself. Believe me, when you get outside of Kansas City, it's a very different story. Because the church that I was the pastor of was 45 minutes north of Kansas City in the middle of farm country. Very different out there. So I'll be interested to see.
Yeah.
Well, I think that is about it for this episode. Tiffany,
all right. Thanks, Jimmy.
Thanks for joining me. Anytime you want to talk out a tough text for prepping for a sermon, let me know. I'll have you back.
Thank you. It's a good way to prepare. It's different than my usual preparation method, but I enjoyed it. So.
Well, to all you listeners, thanks for joining us. Next time, my guests will be people who don't go to church at all. So I'm really intrigued to see how that goes. So,
ooh, that was fun.
Everybody, have a drink and read your Bible. We'll see you next time.
Bye.
Libations and Lectionaries is recorded and edited using Audacity open source audio editing software. The theme song is Funk and Percussions from hooksounds.net, used under the Creative Commons license. Thanks again to Tiffany Curtis for joining me this week. Join us again in 2 weeks when our guests will be Jacob Paris and Molly Miller. We'll see you then.